Sunday night on The Attorney is going to be joined by Josh Wright of the firm Hollis, Wright, talking about trucking accidents, those big rigs. Not a lot of margin for error when things go wrong there, huh?
No, there's not. And some of the stuff we're going to be talking about is what regulations are applicable to tractor-trailer operators, what rules of the road are applicable to those individuals, and what circumstances would you want to have a lawyer involved to properly evaluate a case early on?
Okay. These accidents, really complex, need to have an attorney that really knows their stuff here with these cases.
There's no question. There are so many heightened rules that a tractor-trailer operator has to follow. You want to make sure you've got counsel that knows what those rules are, can apply them to the law, and ensure and maintain you're protected.
That's the kind of stuff we're going to talk about on Sunday night. Hope you join us Sunday night right after the late news here on Channel 13. Josh Wright, we'll see you on Sunday.
Sounds great. Look forward to it.
Good deal. We'll see you on Sunday night.
Car crash cases, defective products, dangerous drugs, injuries, and abuse. Across the state of Alabama, the attorneys, proudly sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright, are here to serve you. Your tough legal questions answered by our experts. The attorneys with Josh Wright from the law firm of Hollis Wright and host David Lamb.
Hello and welcome into The Attorneys. We appreciate you spending your Sunday evening with us. For the next half hour, we're going to be here and answering your questions, dealing with trucking issues. We see those big rigs on the roads all the time, especially the interstates. Questions maybe you have about what rights you have and how they are governed. All that's going to be discussed tonight. Would love to have you join the conversation. You can call, text, email that information on the bottom of the screen all throughout the show tonight. Now, one of the things I like about this is that, as you'll notice, there's no one next to you.
Except you, my friend. Except you.
It's just the two of us.
You are now
right?
the expert on this show.
No, sir. No. I thought this is everything you wanted to ask Josh in 30 minutes or less. But I guess we're gonna tailor it just to trucking issues.
We're gonna just try and address trucking issues as best we can, so that if we get other questions, I'm not gonna be able to answer those tonight. We preface the show, because we've done the show before. We preface, and the law is changing, and that's why we sometimes will do a show another time. There are roughly 500,000 accidents on the road yearly in the United States that involve big rigs and trucks. There are some reasons for that, and it has nothing to do necessarily with tractor-trailer operators doing it the wrong way, because there are plenty that are doing it absolutely 100% the right way, within the rules, within the regulations, and they're just doing a great job. A lot of it has to do with the volume of trucks on the road, the weight of trucks, the fact that they're on interstates. There's just a huge volume of time that they're on the road compared to guys like me and you who operate our cars. But this show is not an indictment on the trucking industry, not an indictment on truckers. It really is not. And we get a lot of calls sometimes from truckers. We do these shows that say, hey man, I'm doing it the right way. And I get it. We all get it. What we're talking about today is when folks are not doing it the right way, and what rights you have and how to protect yourself. The NTSB did a study that involved almost 170 fatalities across the country, and they found that 2/3 of those fatalities, of the 170, 2/3 involved some type of impairment through fatigue, drugs, or alcohol. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that tonight, and the way people can protect themselves out on the road, and if they have unfortunately had a friend or family member that's been involved in a trucking accident, kind of what to do after that.
What laws are there in place that govern not only the companies but even the truckers' conduct?
So it's a great question. One of the interesting things that people don't recognize is, a lot of times don't, the tractor-trailer operators and the businesses that are running these trucking companies, they're held to a much higher standard on the roads than you and I are. When you and I get in our car, we're held to state law, and we're held to the standards of the rules of the road, that you can't violate the rules of the road. When you're a trucker that has a CDL license that's operating a tractor-trailer on our roads across our country, you are subject to not only the same rules that you and I would be, which is the state law rules. You're really also subject to the federal rules. There's an entity out there called the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration that promulgates some statutes. You're also responsible for complying with state laws that are unique to what you and I deal with. Like, for example, in Alabama, we have the Public Service Commission rules. If you're a carrier that operates only within the bounds of the state of Alabama, an intrastate carrier that goes from Tuscaloosa to Birmingham, Birmingham to Montgomery, Montgomery back to Tuscaloosa, you're bound by those rules and regulations. And so the transportation companies have a lot of different regulations, a lot of different laws that are applicable to them that you and I wouldn't have on a daily basis.
Answer a question, hopefully you can answer this. I've always wanted to know this. What happens, I mean, you know there are weigh stations, you see those weigh stations, and you just assume at some point the trucks are being weighed. What is happening there, and does a trucker have to stop at every weigh station? Kind of how does that work, and what's the purpose of those weigh stations you see on the interstates?
It's a good question and a fair question that I think I can field for you. Number one, weight is a significant issue. All right, so our roads are built to certain weight abilities and thresholds, and the cement and the asphalt that's used. A typical car like you and I would operate, you're not going to have any issues. But a tractor trailer, just pounding that over and over and over again, there's a reason why we have weigh stations. We have weigh stations to make sure that we don't have transportation companies hauling too much from state to state, from place to place, to protect the roads that the taxpayers pay for. In addition to that, though, there are checks on the system to confirm that the people that are operating have appropriate CDL licenses, that they are not within or outside of their hours of operation, which I know we'll talk about later. And so there are some things there, mandatory rest times that are applicable to transportation companies. Some things can be regulated there. And the answer to your other question is, do they have to stop at every one? Not necessarily. It really does depend on the timing. It depends on whether or not that weigh station is open or not. Sometimes you'll see them open, sometimes you'll see them closed. And now if you drive, for example, between Birmingham and Atlanta, you will see the computer poles over the top of the road, over the interstate, that have a computer shooting down that can register truckers as they come through and the number of trucks coming through, and can determine whether or not a weigh station should be open and closed, which is an interesting technology.
Interesting. Always wondered what they do with those
yeah,
weigh
and
stations.
let's talk for a second just about, we talked kind of about this heightened standard, Dave, and I think it's important for people to recognize, when you and I operate a vehicle, we have to be licensed, and that's really it. And if we have too many tickets, too many accidents, we may lose our license for a period of time. But for the most part, as long as we are licensed under the law, now in Alabama, as long as we have insurance, we're able to operate. A typical trucker has a totally different standard that they have applied to them. Number one, for example, they have to be medically tested. A lot of people don't recognize that. The people that are out on the road are supposed to be medically tested and medically evaluated through physicals by physicians to confirm that this person who's operating this vehicle with their CDL license, with the weight that they have behind their truck, this person's medically licensed. There has to be background checks done on those individuals before they're hired by an employer to confirm and to ensure that the person is capable of operating a motor vehicle. Those are just a couple of the many, many additional restrictions that are on transportation companies and on truckers that has to be evaluated when you are evaluating whether or not somebody has violated a rule or a regulation or a law that may weigh into a case.
Okay.
So it's something you just gotta go to the right lawyer to be able to evaluate those things.
Time for our first break. Got a question here about someone who's been involved in an accident with a semi, with a large rig. Find out about that question. We'll answer that question. We'd love to take yours as well. Call, text, email. A reminder: an attorney is standing by right now to speak with you. So take advantage of this opportunity. Call the number there. You can text, email. Also find the firm of Hollis Wright on Facebook as well as Twitter. Stay tuned. More of the attorneys coming right up.
I'm Carter Clay with the law firm of Hollis Wright. Thanks for watching The Attorneys on WVTM 13. Now we hope you, a friend, or a loved one never need legal counsel for a case. But if you do, the goal of this show is simple: to provide answers and legal counsel when you need it the most. Your call to the show is free, so if you have questions specific to this show or related to other specific legal matters, call, email, or text us to talk with one of our lawyers. You can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter to learn about important legal news that could affect you or your family member. Or simply contact us by going to WVTM13.com and click on the attorney's link. Now, we know your time is valuable, so thank you for spending it with us and for watching The Attorneys right here on WVTM 13.
We'll go back into the attorneys talking about semi-truck accidents. What are their rules and regulations that they have to go by, and what are your rights as well on the roadway? Talking about that tonight, and would love to have you join the conversation. Call, text, email, that information at the bottom of the screen all throughout the show. As we went to break, there's a question here about the timeliness of reporting accidents. Whenever you've been involved in an accident involving a truck, how quickly should you gain some sort of legal counsel?
General statute of limitation for a trucking case is 2 years, which means from the time of the accident, the day of the accident, you've got 2 years to file. A lot of times we'll see in other shows that we do that when there are federal regulations or state regulations that are applicable, there are pre-filing requirements.
Okay.
In Alabama, in a trucking case, you don't generally have those with the federal regulations that apply to truckers. So you've generally got 2 years. Now, that answer would change just a little bit under certain circumstances. If the accident happens in, for example, Mississippi, a lot of times people are traveling back into Alabama, the law in that state may be applicable.
Now, why is it more important in a trucking accident case than a case involving a regular vehicle? Is it more imperative to the timeliness of reporting? Is there a reason timeliness is so much more important?
I think so. Trucking companies have what they call rapid response teams. And David, I can't tell you the number of cases I've had where we may be on the scene with our expert witnesses to do an accident reconstruction and to evaluate the scene and take pictures of the vehicle and statementize officers, the things that you do to get a case worked up quickly. We're there on day 2, 3, but the trucking company's already been there. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world that the trucking company's there first, but I will say this. There's no question that he who gets to the officer and the witnesses first generally gets a better statement and gets a more thorough statement and can get more information out of somebody. People like to give a statement one time, and then when you ask them to give a statement the second time and a third time and a fourth time, they start to have a problem with it. And so, you want to be on the scene as quick as you can. And the reason that these trucking companies have rapid response teams is to ensure and maintain that they're protecting the company and protecting the tractor trailer driver to make sure that the facts are properly presented before the jury. Well, the same thing is true on our end. We want to make sure that the facts are presented appropriately and correctly and 100% accurately. The other issue is that a lot of times you can have what's called stale evidence. The longer you delay, the more difficult it is for people to remember things that happened.
Right.
Logbooks may be discarded after a certain period of time. That would be applicable to a driver, where you can do an audit to determine whether or not he was operating in his hours of service. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Officers may have another 250 accidents that they've worked and they have forgotten information. So the timeliness is very, very critical in these cases.
For drivers of just a regular car or truck, there are insurance obligations relative to truckers and trucking companies. Are there similar obligations in terms of the amount of insurance they must have?
There is. It's just more insurance generally. The federal regulations require that a tractor trailer operator has at least $750,000 of coverage. So almost $1 million worth of coverage for that tractor trailer operator. However, that amount can be expanded and be greater in circumstances depending on the freight that's being hauled. For example, if you're hauling toxic material versus lumber, you may have a different requirement on the amount of insurance that you have to have. If you're hauling individuals, like a bus, you may have to have a heightened amount of insurance. It can be as high as $10 million and as low as $750,000. And hiring a lawyer on the front end to evaluate the case, to ensure and maintain that all the appropriate insurances are applicable, is most important. And David, I'll tell you why. the insurance becomes applicable and is helpful in these cases. About 35% of all these accidents on the road involving tractor-trailer drivers, it's not necessarily because they're doing it the wrong way. It may be their company is pushing them. Fatigue is a huge component to this thing, and that's the statistic. 30 to 35% of all accidents involve fatigue with tractor-trailer operators. And again, it may not be the tractor-trailer operator's fault. It may actually be the company that's pushing him to haul freight from point A to point B. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll do what's called logbook audits. We have experts that come in, and we can tell you, based on the amount of miles and the distance and the governors that may be on one of these vehicles that controls their speed, how many hours somebody actually operated to get from Phoenix, Arizona to Dallas, Texas, or to Birmingham, Alabama. We do these audits on their logbooks, which have to be maintained for 6 months, to be able to prove and establish whether people were inside or outside their hours of service. Now, I don't want to get too technical in today's show, but we've talked about this in the past. Fatigue is such an important factor. Traditionally, and under the current law, a tractor-trailer operator, you see them on the side of the road sometimes sleeping in their bunk. There's a reason for that. If they have 10 hours of off time, where they're eating, they're sleeping, whatever it may be, they can be on for 11 hours in a consecutive day. So they can operate for 11 hours in that day, and that's it. After 11 hours, they're done. They're not able to operate. So if you're operating past 11 hours in their logbooks or based on these audits we talk about, they're violating the law. They shouldn't even be on the road because of fatigue. In addition to that, there are other rules. If you've operated as an employee for 14 hours in a day, you're doing paperwork, you're at the shop, you're helping load trucks. After 14 hours of work, even if you've only operated a truck for 5 hours, you cannot drive, period, after 14 hours. And those regulations change. There's also a 7-day rule of 60 hours, a 8-day rule of 70 hours. I don't want to get too technical, and I already probably have, but point being, you want to get to a lawyer that understands this stuff and has the experts that can evaluate these logbooks to ensure and maintain, was the trucker supposed to be on the road in the first place? We have a case recently where we were able to determine that the operator of the tractor trailer should have never even been on the road because he was outside of his limits of liability, and he didn't ever apply his brakes until after he made contact with our vehicle, causing the injury that he did. And so that'll tell you he wasn't paying attention because he was fatigued. He was tired. Does that necessarily mean it's all his fault? No, probably not, because the trucking company was pushing him to go from point A to point B. And again, we're not saying all tractor trailer companies do it the wrong way, because they don't. There are some out there that are just following the rules, doing it the right way, complying with the regulations. But we're here today really talking about those that aren't and what you need to do in those circumstances.
Time for us to take our second break and final break of the evening. As we do so, a reminder, just time enough for you to get your question into us, call, text, email. Also a reminder, if you search the term Hollis Wright, you'll find them on Facebook, a good follow there, as well as on Twitter. On Twitter it's Hollis_Wright. Some great legal tips and ways to keep up on things that matter to you there in the legal realm. Stay tuned. We have more of the attorneys coming right up.
I'm Carter Clay with the law firm of Hollis Wright. When you serve on a jury, you might expect to have all of the evidence presented to you during the course of a case. But there are some forms of evidence that are not allowed in court. In tonight's Legal 411, we are answering the question, why can't jurors see police incident reports? Most jurors would like to see crash reports during a trial, especially since these documents almost always show the investigating officer's opinion on who was at fault for the crash. Unfortunately, Alabama law prohibits the introduction of such reports into evidence. Alabama law states that no such accident report shall be used as evidence in any trial, civil or criminal, arising out of an accident. According to lawmakers who wrote and approved this rule, the reason accident reports cannot be admitted as evidence is that a jury might place too much weight on an official document such as a police report. There are some exceptions to this rule, of course, but most courts generally won't allow this type of evidence to be shown to a jury. Despite this rule, police officers who investigate crashes are still allowed to testify. They can tell a jury what they saw at the scene of the crash, including the road conditions and the positions of automobiles. An officer can also inform a jury of most any statement the people involved in the crash may have said to the officer during the investigation. The accident report can even be used to refresh an officer's memory of the crash. But the actual document itself cannot be introduced into evidence, and the officer's opinion of who is at fault is also excluded. That's because the jury is charged with deciding fault based on all the facts presented. Please remember, your call, email, or text to the attorneys is free. All of us at Hollis Wright want to help answer your questions on real issues you face. Remember, a competent lawyer will always respond to every question you send in. That's our pledge and promise to you.
Welcome back into the attorneys. Appreciate you being with us tonight. Just a few minutes remaining in tonight's show. So if you want to join the conversation, call, text, email, get those questions into us. Josh, in dealing with trucking cases, why are particularly these cases and these accidents so significant, you think?
I think it's a good question. I think there are a couple reasons. Number one, you're dealing with an entity that may weigh 40 to 50,000 pounds versus a vehicle that weighs 3,000 to 4,000 pounds. Wow. Number two, you're dealing generally with interstate speeds, so significant speeds. And number three, you're dealing with a huge volume of hours that tractor trailers are on the road compared to me and you.
Right.
You know, I may operate my vehicle because I got to go to Montgomery and then back. But traditionally, I'm going from my home to my office, maybe my office somewhere in Birmingham, and then back home. So I'm not on the interstate nearly as much. And so I think those are three reasons why when there is an accident, it generally is a catastrophic accident. And David, I want to point out, you know, it's important to get a lawyer involved early in these cases because of these rapid response teams like we talked about. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of times when we will evaluate a case, and that's what we do. We evaluate the case. We don't just get one statement. We will get our investigator involved, we'll get our experts involved, we'll do accident reconstructions, we'll do all the things that are necessary to evaluate the case. And by the way, these cases are taken on what's called a contingency, where the individual doesn't have to pay for any of these costs. We pay for these costs. But we do that to determine, is there a case? Mm-hmm. There are lots of times when, guess what? Guys like me and you on the road are the ones that caused the accident. Right. And the tractor trailer company wasn't doing anything wrong whatsoever. Right. And so that's why you have to fully and completely evaluate a case to determine who's responsible, what are the rights of the individual that may have been injured at no fault of their own, and who's really responsible for compensating the individual that was injured in the case. I have done as much as represented trucking companies. I've represented truckers that have been involved in accidents, and I've turned down case after case after case in my practice of circumstances where the individual operator of the vehicle is the one that contributed to the injury. In fact, I've got a case right now in Texas where we had to do the exact same thing because the individual was the one that caused the accident, and the trucker was doing it the right way, just operating correctly.
Are trying cases, I know you have quite a bit of experience with these cases, are these cases more complex and also I would think if you have to, sleep patterns or rest patterns and all those sort of things, you would have to use experts. Are they more of a challenge and therefore more expensive?
I think they are a little more expensive. These cases are taken by lawyers like our firm on a contingency where the individual can have the same level of service for investigation and litigation as the trucking company does. And that's the beauty of the contingency relationship, where you're only compensated if you're successful in the case. And so the individual has that same level of service that anybody else would get on the business side. They are a little more complex. You have to know the rules and regulations. You have to know, for example, that immediately after an accident, a tractor trailer operator is going to be drug tested because the law requires it, and how to get those drug tests. You have to have experts that are accident reconstructionists that on day 2 or 3, if the trucking company did it on day 1, can be in Dallas, Texas, doing an accident reconstruction to determine the speeds of the vehicle. determine how the vehicles interacted with each other, who was the contributing cause, download black box information from the vehicles to determine what speeds they were at the time of the accident. So it takes more effort. It's not necessarily more complex, but it definitely takes more effort. And you've got to be able to have the experts in place to really successfully manage these cases. You know, we talked in the second segment about audits. We have audit experts that will literally come in and they will look at a logbook that has to be maintained by a trucking company for 6 months. And they will audit that 6-month period to determine, based on the governor that that company says they have on their tractor trailer where the vehicle doesn't go higher than 67 miles an hour, based on the fact that the person was a long haul driver from Dallas, Texas to Birmingham, Alabama, how many miles can you go with that governor based on this time, and are you within your hours of service? We'll audit logbooks to determine, was the person even supposed to be on the road in the first place? So those are just some examples of what makes these cases a little more complex.
I have about 3 minutes remaining, but would love to hear some real world examples and some cases that trucking cases that you all have seen.
Yeah, so you know, a lot of times driver fatigue is a pretty significant role. So these audits are critically important to determine whether or not somebody was even supposed to be on the road. It's an easy argument for a lawyer where a tractor trailer company has caused an accident to be able to say, had this individual been complying with the federal regulations, had the company not pushed the driver to do more than they were supposed to, they would have never been on the road in the first place. I see a lot of medical cases. I've got a case that we completed where an individual had a heart attack while he was operating a vehicle hauling individuals around, ran off the road, and unfortunately our individual lost a leg because of it. And had that individual complied with the regulations and been medically, physically fit, and they had a high blood pressure problem that contributed to this accident, had they been more medically fit, that accident would have never happened. And so, you know, sometimes you'll see medical cases. A lot of times we see maintenance cases, David. I've got a case right now where a trucking company did not maintain a certain set of tires, and the wheels that are held on to the axles, they actually will rub at some point, and the lug nuts will rub right through the wheel where the wheel comes off, causing an accident, causing somebody to hit it. So a lot of times the cases can be maintenance cases. With all that said, there are plenty of companies doing it the right way. Plenty of companies doing it the right way.
Yeah. We have just a couple minutes remaining. Time enough for you to give a kind of a final thought and a final charge to our viewers.
You know, we talk a lot about the importance of a contingency fee contract and how that process works. It is so important to have a lawyer that handles these cases on a contingency to handle those in the trucking realm, because of the cost and the complexity and the time that it takes to litigate these cases. So you want to insure and maintain regardless of who you go to. And we often say, you don't have to come to us. There are great lawyers out there doing this stuff, but go to somebody, and go to somebody early, and make sure you find somebody that's handling these on a contingency fee contract that can properly evaluate the case and come back to you, David, and say, either you have a case or you don't, and if you do have a case, here's how we're going to proceed, and here's how this case is going to progress to where you have the right to be compensated for your interests.
Great place for us to leave it tonight. Josh?
Good to see you. Hey, and by the way, I enjoyed this one-on-one. We ought to do this more often.
Keep those folks out of the way.
Keep everybody out of here. I like it.
Appreciate you, Josh. Thanks for being with us. Thank you for joining us as well. As we wrap things up, here is how you can get in touch with the firm of Hollis Wright. We'll see you next week, folks, right here on The Attorneys.
Thanks for watching The Attorneys, sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright.